There is a particular quality to Kentucky light in late July. It doesn't fall so much as it settles thick and amber, the way honey settles through water pressing down on everything it touches. The hills hold the heat the way old houses hold old smells. And by 4 in the afternoon, the whole world feels slow and deliberate, like it's thinking something through. On July 23, 1987, 4 boys rode their bicycles to the edge of those hills. They were not running away from anything. They were running toward something, the particular urgent 11 to 13-year-old feeling that this was it, the last real adventure before everything changed, before the summer ended and Tommy Hensley moved away to Lexington and the 4 of them became a kind of friends who were close once. They had a backpack. They had snack cakes and flashlights. They had a compass, borrowed from Tommy's father's desk drawer, and they had a map. They trusted the map completely. They never came home. Ashland, Kentucky. July 23, 1987, 3047 p.m. You have to understand what Ashland smelled like that afternoon, or you won't understand why 4 boys would choose to spend their last days of summer in the woods. It smelled like honeysuckle at aggressive, almost too sweet flowering that grows in tangles along every chain-link fence and concrete retaining wall in Boyd County. It smelled like tar softening in the heat of the road, and like the Ohio River, which you couldn't see from Ashland's residential streets but could sense, the way you sense a large animal in the dark. The river was there, just north, brown and wide and indifferent, and underneath all of it, cut grass, engine oil, and the particular mineral sweetness of the hills themselves. Eastern Kentucky, Appalachian foothills. A terrain that looks gentle from a distance and reveals its complications only when you're inside it. The 4 boys had grown up inside it. They knew those woods the way children know anything they love, not systematically, not scientifically, but with a deep and comfortable intimacy. They knew where the creek bent and made a swimming hole. They knew which ridge gave the best view of the valley. They knew, in the confident and imprecise way of boys who haven't yet discovered their own limitations, that they knew enough. Tommy Hensley was 13 years old and the undisputed leader of whatever 4-boy enterprise was currently underway. He was not loud about this authority. He didn't need to be. Tommy had the quality that certain natural leaders possess, an absolute, unperformed certainty about what to do next. He was the kid who decided where you ate lunch, who decided what game you played after school, who decided in the particular domestic crisis of 1987 that, before his father's job transfer moved the family to Lexington, before the boxes were packed and the goodbyes were said, there was one more thing that needed doing. His parents, Ray and Linda Hensley, had noticed the move was hitting Tommy harder than his younger brother. Though Tommy wouldn't say so. He just got quieter. He spent more time outside. He spent more time with Jake and Mark and Ricky. What Linda Hensley would later tell investigators, what she would repeat in slightly different language for the next 28 years, was this: he wasn't sad about leaving. He was trying to finish something. He wanted to do it right. The trip to the Colton Woods was Tommy's idea of doing it right. Jake Porter was 12 and had been Tommy's closest friend since 2nd grade. When Tommy had pushed a 6th grader off Jake's bicycle and then calmly picked the bicycle up and handed it back without explanation, Jake was quiet in the way that some children are quiet, not from shyness but from preference. He liked to watch things happen before he commented on them. He read books above his grade level. He kept a journal, a habit he'd picked up from a school assignment and continued because he found it useful. He brought the journal on the trip. Jake's mother, Beverly Porter, would recall that Jake had seemed happy that morning. Not elevated or manic, just settled, peaceful. He ate all his breakfast, she would say, as if this detail contained some clue. He ate everything. Mark Dalton was 12, solidly built, and possessed of a practical intelligence that made him the group's de facto safety officer, a role he embraced without irony. Mark was the one who checked that the flashlights had batteries. Mark was the one who insisted they bring extra water. Mark was the one who, on the morning of the 23rd, showed up at Tommy's house carrying a standard first aid kit in a red zip pouch, the kind sold at gas stations, which he had purchased with his own lawn mowing money. He was, by every account, the careful one, the sensible one. Later, this would matter in ways that made the tragedy almost unbearable, because Mark had done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Ricky Cole was 11, the youngest, the newest addition to the group's informal membership. He had moved to Ashland the previous September and had spent most of that school year on the periphery of things, the way new kids do. Tommy had absorbed him into the group with characteristically casual decisiveness sometime around March, and Ricky had spent the subsequent months in a state of quiet, grateful disbelief at his own good fortune. He was not the most skilled outdoorsman, he was not the most confident, but he was, according to everyone who knew him, cheerful in a way that wasn't annoying and natural enthusiasm that made things feel more significant just by being witnessed by him. Ricky's mother, Donna Cole, would say he would have followed those boys anywhere. He just wanted to be part of something. She would say this with a love that had no bitterness in it, which was perhaps the most heartbreaking thing about her. By 4 p.m., the 4 boys were assembled in the Hensley driveway loading their backpacks. The inventory, as reconstructed from what they asked their parents for and what was later found, was practical and adolescent in equal measure. 2 packs of Hostess cupcakes, a bag of Planters peanuts, 4 water bottles, a box of matches in a Ziploc bag, the first aid kit, 2 flashlights with spare batteries, a folded rain poncho, a hunting knife in a leather sheath, Tommy's, approved by Ray Hensley, and the compass. And the map. The map deserves particular attention because the map is the story. It was a topographic trail map of the Colton Woods and surrounding forest, a printed document distributed by the Boyd County Parks and Recreation Office sometime in the early 1980s. It showed the major trails, the ridgelines, the creek beds. It showed, with confident cartographic authority, the network of paths available to hikers in that area. It showed, specifically, a trail marked as the Southern Spur, a path that curved south from the main Colton Fire Tower Trail, ran along the upper edge of a drainage basin, and eventually connected back to a county road 2 miles from town. The boys planned to use this trail as their return route. It was, on the map, a clean and logical loop. You went out along the Fire Tower Trail, you camped somewhere scenic in the middle, and you came home along the Southern Spur. This was a sound plan, executed with the reasonable confidence of 4 boys who had spent their whole childhoods in these hills and were consulting a map issued by the county itself. The map was 9 years out of date, but they didn't know that. Nobody told them. The map was on the rack in the Parks and Recreation Office, alongside current brochures about fishing licenses and public pool hours, and it looked authoritative because it was printed on heavy paper with a county seal in the corner, and there was absolutely no reason any of them could have had to question it. Tommy folded the map along its existing creases and tucked it into the outer pocket of his backpack. He zipped it shut with the particular finality of someone who has planned a thing and is now executing it. "Let's go," he said. The last confirmed sighting of the 4 boys occurred at approximately 5 p.m. near the trailhead at the base of the Colton Fire Tower access road. A man named Gerald Pitts, 56, was walking his beagle, Chester, along the gravel access road when he saw them. He would later describe them to investigators with the clarity of a man who had no idea his observation would matter. 4 boys on bikes. Big smiles. One of them waved at me. The tall one, dark hair. I waved back. Chester barked at them. They laughed at Chester. The tall one with dark hair was Tommy Hensley. Gerald Pitts watched them lock their bikes to a fence post. He would remember this detail specifically, how they locked the bikes, how they were being responsible about it, and disappear single file into the tree line. He walked Chester home. He had dinner. He watched the news. He would not know until the following afternoon that he was the last person outside those woods to see them alive. July 24th, 1987, 12:08 a.m. The first phone call was made at 12:08 a.m. when Linda Hensley, who had told herself since 9 o'clock that boys camp out sometimes and fall asleep, and she should go to bed, finally admitted to herself that she was not going to sleep. She called Beverly Porter. Beverly Porter had been awake since 11. By 12:30 a.m., all 4 families had confirmed to the same thing. Nobody had heard from their sons. By 1:15 a.m., the Boyd County Sheriff's Department had received the missing persons report. By 2 a.m., deputies were at the trailhead, their flashlight beams cutting across the locked bicycles, still leaning against the fence post. By dawn, the full apparatus of a formal search and rescue operation had begun to assemble, with a speed and scale that reflected in some measure The accumulated guilt of a community that knew, even if it could not articulate, the knowledge that the woods were not always safe, that the hills had complications, that children should not be underestimated, but neither should the terrain. The search command post was established at the parking area near the fire tower trailhead, a gravel clearing that became, over the following days, a small and heartbreaking city of folding tables and radio equipment and coffee urns and people. Boyd County Sheriff's Department, State Police, volunteer fire departments from 3 counties, search and rescue teams. By the second morning, National Guard units had been requested. Bloodhound teams arrived from Frankfort. What you noticed, if you were standing in that clearing at, say, 7 a.m. on the morning of July 25th, was the sound of it. Radios, constant, crackling radios, talking to each other and to the teams in the woods, a language of call signs and coordinates and 10-4s, and the occasional burst of static that sounded almost human. Boots on gravel. The particular mechanical conversation of helicopter rotors, 2 county birds, and 1 state police aircraft taking turns over the canopy, which was dense enough that they could see almost nothing. The low, continuous murmur of people relaying information to other people. The whole terrible bureaucracy of looking for someone who doesn't want to be lost. And underneath all of it, if you listened, the silence of the woods themselves. The tree line began 30 feet from the command post, and it absorbed everything. Voices went in and didn't come back. It swallowed sound the way deep water swallows light, not violently, just completely. Linda Hensley sat at one of the folding tables for 16 hours on the second day without going home. Someone had given her a styrofoam cup of coffee that she held in both hands without drinking. Ray Hensley was in the woods with the second sweep team, because being in the woods was something he could do and sitting at the table was something he could not. Linda sat at the table because she understood, without anyone telling her, that someone from the family needed to be there, visible, present, holding that styrofoam cup just in case. In case of what, she could not have said. The Bloodhound teams were managed by a handler named Curtis Boone, 44, a veteran tracker from a search and rescue cooperative out of Moorhead. He ran 3 dogs over the 2 days of active searching, a male named Colonel, a female named Bess, and a younger male named Duke, who was on only his second real deployment. On the afternoon of July 25th, approximately 36 hours into the search, Colonel led Curtis Boone to a location approximately 1.2 miles south of the main fire tower trail, near a drainage gully where a tributary of Colton Creek had cut a narrow channel through the hillside. The gully was maybe 8 feet across and 4 feet deep in its deepest section, and it was full of dark, mud-dense, wet, clay-heavy mud that had the look of something recently displaced. Colonel went berserk at that gully. This is the precise word Curtis Boone would use in his report, and in his later testimony, and in every conversation he would have about those 4 boys for the rest of his life. Berserk. Colonel circled the gully 3 times, pulling at the lead with a desperation that was unusual even for a scent dog working a hot trail. He barked. He threw his nose at the mud, then lifted it and barked again. He paced the edge of the gully with an agitation that, to anyone trained in reading bloodhound behavior, meant one thing. Here, whatever you are looking for, it is here. The deputies who examined the gully saw what they expected to see. Mud. Dark, shifted mud with the irregular surface of recently disturbed earth. One deputy climbed down into the gully and probed the mud with a stick. He didn't go deep enough. The mud was dense and stable and offered no visual clue. There was no sign of clothing, no sign of disturbance above the mud line. Nothing that a human eye trained on what a human eye expected to find could interpret as evidence. They called Colonel off. They moved on. Curtis Boone would not forgive himself for this for 28 years. I knew, he would say in 2015, when the truth was finally excavated. His voice by then had the particular flatness of a man who has said something so many times inside his own head that saying it out loud felt like reciting rather than confessing. I knew Colonel was right. I've never seen him wrong, but I couldn't tell them to start digging up a gully because my dog was upset. That's not how it works. I needed more. There wasn't more to give them. The storm. July 26 to 27, 1987. On the evening of July 26th, the Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm watch for Boyd and surrounding counties. By midnight, the watch had become a warning. By 2 a.m. on July 27th, The storm the meteorologists would later describe as a slow-moving inland convective system had parked itself over the hills south of Ashland and began dismantling the world beneath it. 5 inches of rain fell in 48 hours. This number requires translation, because 5 inches in 48 hours in that particular geography is not merely uncomfortable. The hills of eastern Kentucky are karst terrain limestone country, characterized by sinkholes and underground drainage and soil that sits atop a network of voids like fabric stretched over an absence. When water comes in quantity, it doesn't just run off. It moves. It reroutes. It finds the underground channels and fills them. It finds the drainage gullies, the gullies carved by Colton Creek and its tributaries, and it converts them into small rivers. The trails turned into watercourses. Established paths eroded. The forest floor, already saturated, began moving in places, slow, terrible movement, the kind that happens in fractions of inches per hour and looks like nothing until it looks like everything. The command post became an emergency weather shelter. Rescue teams were pulled out of the woods. Search helicopters were grounded. For 48 hours, the forest was completely inaccessible. And in the hills above the Hollerbend drainage, where a narrow limestone overhang above an old gully had been holding a particular configuration of earth and stone in uncertain equilibrium, the rain pressed down and down and down. When the rain finally stopped and the teens went back in, they found a forest that had reorganized itself. Trails that had been passable were buried under 6 inches of new silt. The drainage gully where Colonel had barked the gully that had looked like dark mud had risen and smoothed and settled and looked, now, like ordinary hillside. Undifferentiated, unremarkable. The world had covered its own evidence. The search was officially suspended on August 3, 1987, 11 days after the boys had entered the woods. Sheriff Dale Marbury, a man who, by all accounts, was neither negligent nor careless, but who was working with the tools and knowledge available to him in 1987, held a press conference in the parking lot of the Boyd County Courthouse. He was visibly exhausted. His voice, in the footage preserved by the local news station, has the careful neutrality of a man holding something back. Based on the evidence gathered, he said, and the conditions encountered in the search area, we believe the boys became disoriented and succumbed to the elements, likely during the storm event of July 26th through the 27th. We are moving to a recovery posture. The investigation remains open. He took 3 questions and then walked away from the microphones. What he did not say, what he could not say, because he did not yet know, it was where they were, only that they were gone. The town, doing what towns do when they need an explanation and can't find a factual one, settled on the story of the Colton Woods curse. It was not a specific or well-developed mythology. It had been referenced vaguely in connection with 2 hunting accidents in the 1960s and the disappearance of an elderly man in 1971, who had actually wandered from an assisted living facility and been found 3 days later confused but alive in a farmhouse 6 miles away. The curse was the kind of story that exists primarily as a container for things that don't fit anywhere else. And for the next 28 years, the Ashland boys filled it. A ritual every July, on the 23rd, the anniversary of the day the boys went in, Linda Hensley drove to a ridge above the Colton Woods trailhead. She parked her car on the gravel shoulder. She walked to a flat-topped stump that had been a white oak once, before the 1993 ice storm brought it down, and she placed 4 green plastic toy soldiers on the stump in a row. She didn't pray. Exactly. She wasn't sure prayer was the right word for what she did. She stood at the stump, and she talked to Tommy. She told him what had happened in the last year, her younger son's graduation, the birth of a grandchild, what was growing in the garden. She told him she still had his Detroit Tigers cap on the hook by the back door. She told him she still couldn't watch Stand By Me, which had come out that same summer because the boys in it reminded her of boys she knew. She always said the same thing before she left. She would say it quietly, to the stump and the soldiers and the tree line and whatever was in the tree line. You're not lost anymore. You're not lost. You just went somewhere I can't follow yet. Then she would walk back to her car and drive home. She did this for 28 years. She missed only once in 2001 when she was hospitalized for a hip replacement, and she cried about missing it with an intensity that confused her nurses. The garage deputy Harold Vickers had been on the search in 1987. He was 29 then, 3 years on the department, and the Ashland boys case was the one that didn't leave him. He retired in 2009 after 30 years with Boyd County Sheriffs. His wife, Patricia, had been patient about a great many things over those 30 years, and she remained patient about the garage. The garage was Harold's. By unspoken agreement, he had a workbench in there, and a radio, and a space heater for winter, and 3 large folding tables pushed together to form one long surface. The tables were covered in topographic maps. He had 8 different versions of the Colton Woods area USGS quad sheets in various vintages. The 1987 parts map, aerial photographs from 1985, 1982, and 2003, a Forest Service survey from 1989, and 2 maps he had made himself on grid paper, extrapolating from contour lines, trying to work out how water would flow through that terrain after a major rain event. He had marked all of them with red ink, red circles for areas searched, red lines for trails confirmed clear, red question marks, and there were many red question marks for areas where the search had been incomplete, or where the terrain had changed after the storm, or where something hadn't added up. He had, over 22 years of returning to this problem in the evenings while Patricia watched television inside and the neighbors' lights went off one by one, developed a theory. The theory was this: the boys had gone south, not the east trending route the search had prioritized, south. And the reason Harold Vickers believed this was that he had, in 2002, walked the southern edge of the search area himself, alone on a Saturday in October, and discovered that the terrain changed dramatically below a certain ridgeline. It dropped into a low basin, a bowl, carved by karst geology, rimmed with limestone outcroppings, draining poorly. A place that held water, a place where, if you were following a trail that no longer existed, you might descend into it and find the walls steeper than they looked from above. He had written this up in a formal memo in 2003 and submitted it to the department. It was noted and filed. He wrote it again in 2007, with more detail and an attached map. The new Sheriff Dale Marbury had retired in 1999, acknowledged receipt. Harold Vickers sat in his garage in the evenings and looked at his maps and thought about 4 boys who went south when everybody searched east. He thought about the dog Curtis Boone's Colonel, barking at a muddy gully in the middle of nowhere. And he traced on his grid paper map the distance from that gully to the limestone basin he'd found in October of 2002. And the number he got back was not large. He thought, I'm not wrong. I know I'm not wrong. But knowing isn't enough. And it's never been enough. And it isn't enough now. He turned off the garage light. He went inside to bed. He did this for 22 years. The backpack, 2008. In March of 2008, a man named Kevin Strauss, who lived in Huntington, West Virginia, purchased a lot of miscellaneous law enforcement items from an online auction administered by the Boyd County Sheriff's Department. The auction was one of those periodic clearances of evidence room inventory items from closed or inactive cases, auctioned off to recover storage costs. Standard practice, legal, routine. In the lot Kevin Strauss received was a canvas backpack, olive green, military surplus style. It was dirty but intact, and carved into the nylon strap carved with what appeared to be a pocket knife. In the block lettering of a teenage boy were 2 letters, T.H. Kevin Strauss. To his considerable credit, recognized immediately what he had. He called the Boyd County Sheriff's Department within 24 hours of receiving the lot. The subsequent investigation into how Tommy Hensley's backpack had ended up in an evidence room auction was both brief and conclusive in its findings. It had been misfiled. The backpack had been recovered during the initial search in 1987, found on a trail roughly half a mile east of the Fire Tower trailhead, empty, having likely been removed from Tommy's back at some point and left, and had been logged under the wrong case number, a clerical error that had caused it to sit in the evidence room for 20 years before being swept into an inactive inventory clearance. What the backpack confirmed, the boys had been in the woods. They had gone east first, or at least Tommy had been east at some point, or the backpack had been left on the eastern trail as a marker, or the analysis stalled there, as analysis tends to when the evidence is ambiguous and the principles are gone. The backpack was reclassified under the correct case number. A brief follow-up search was conducted in the eastern area. Nothing new was found. For Harold Vickers, the backpack was significant in a way he could not explain to anyone's satisfaction. The backpack was empty. Tommy's map had been in the outer pocket of his backpack. If the backpack was empty, that meant Tommy still had the map when he moved on. He was still navigating. He was still trying to follow the plan. They didn't panic, Harold Vickers told the current sheriff, in a meeting that lasted 40 minutes and ended with the same polite acknowledgement as all the previous meetings. They were oriented. They were following the map, and the map took them south. October 14, 2015, Daniel Merritt was 34 years old, an amateur geologist and serious hiker who had been exploring the off-trail terrain of the Colton Woods area every autumn for 6 years. He was interested in the karst formations, the limestone outcroppings that appeared unexpectedly in the forest, freshly exposed by erosion, pale against the darker stone and soil around them like bones surfacing through earth. On the morning of October 14th, he was working his way along the bottom of what locals called the limestone cut a narrow ravine, where the rock had split along a fault line, exposing walls of pale gray limestone on either side. The cut was not on any trail map. It wasn't on the 1987 Parks map, wasn't on the USGS quads as a named feature, wasn't anywhere that anyone had cause to go unless they were specifically looking for it. Daniel Merritt was specifically looking for it in the way that geologists look for things with patience and lateral attention, a willingness to examine what's at the bottom and edge of things rather than the center. At 10:23 a.m., he saw the tin. It was wedged in a horizontal crack in the limestone wall, maybe 3 feet above the ravine floor, wedged there, deliberately, pushed in as far as it would go, tucked under an overhang of rock, as if placed by someone who wanted it protected from rain. It had been there long enough to rust along its seams, long enough for the label to disintegrate entirely, leaving only a ghost of adhesive stain. It was roughly the size of a large coffee can, with a lid that had been pressed shut and then bent slightly downward to seal it more tightly. Daniel Merritt's hands, he would later say, were shaking when he lifted it out. He knew. He didn't know why. He knew he had no particular connection to the Ashland boys' case, had moved to Boyd County only in 2010. But there was something about the deliberateness of the placement, the care of it, the tin pressed into a crack in the limestone as if by someone who understood they needed to make it last, that told him before he opened it what he was going to find. He opened it anyway. The lid resisted and then gave. Inside, sealed in something that had once been a plastic bag, but had partially degraded to a film with material stuck to the contents, a composition notebook, swollen with ancient water damage, its pages fused in some places and separated in others, the cardboard cover warped but whole, and beneath the notebook, wrapped in the remnants of the same plastic, a Polaroid photograph. The photograph had bleached significantly. Polaroid chemistry from the 1980s, was not designed for decades in a tin can, but it was readable. 4 boys stood in front of a wooden trail marker sign. The sign read, "END of Trail." They were smiling, all 4 of them, caught in that particular adolescent pose of boys who are trying to look cool for a photograph, and failing because they are too happy to be cool. Tommy Hensley, tall and dark-haired, stood slightly in front of the others, which seemed right. Jake Porter had his arms crossed, which also seemed right. Mark Dalton was squinting into the sun. Ricky Cole was laughing at something outside the frame. Daniel Merritt sat down on the floor of the limestone cut. He was crying, though we would not fully register this until later. He called 911 from his cell phone. He stayed on the line until help arrived. The notebook, Jake Porter's journal, identified later by Beverly Porter with a certainty that took her breath away when she saw the first page, was delivered to the Kentucky State Police Forensic Documents Unit in Frankfort. The analysis would take 4 months and produce a 47-page report, but the initial examination, conducted by forensic document examiner Sandra Whitfield in the first week after discovery, yielded the most important finding almost immediately. On the last written page of the notebook, the final entry, which was dated July 25th in Jake Porter's careful handwriting, there were 2 layers of text. The first layer was visible to the naked eye. It had been written in pencil rather than the blue ink pen Jake had used for earlier entries, suggesting the pen had run out or been lost. The pencil text was faded and water-stained but largely legible after careful photographic enhancement. The second layer was invisible. It had been written with the pen, but the pen, by then, was out of ink. Jake or one of the others had pressed the inkless pen into the last page of the notebook in the dark, writing by touch, writing words they could not see themselves but needed to leave. The impression of the letters in the paper was microscopic, measurable in thousandths of a millimeter, but it was there. Infrared imaging revealed it. The technique infrared reflectance photography, used routinely in art conservation and document authentication photographs at wavelengths beyond the visible spectrum, and it is capable of detecting pressure indentations in paper that contain no ink at all, because the pressed fibers of the paper reflect infrared light differently than undisturbed fibers. Sandra Whitfield ran the last page under infrared at 2000 in the morning on November 3, 2015, and read the words for the first time with a researcher's trained detachment that lasted approximately 30 seconds before it failed her entirely. We see flashes through the trees. The flash was lightning. The storm that had grounded the helicopters and turned the trails into rivers. The storm that, from the floor of the Hollerbend Basin, would have been visible only as reflected light through the canopy flashes in the dark, random, and terrible. They had no idea a landslide was coming. The note, July 25, 1987, approximately 9 p.m. Read this slowly, the full pencil text of the final entry, reconstructed from photographic enhancement and presented to the families in a private meeting on December 8, 2015, reads as follows. July 25th, don't know time, cloudy. We went down the wrong ridge, we found out because there was no path where the map says path. Mark's hurt. He fell on the rocks, not bad, but he can't walk on it. We made a shelter by some limestone rocks. There's an overhang. Tommy says we stay here until somebody finds us. We have 2 Twinkies and a little water. Jake is writing this. We have been here 2 days, we think. The sun's gone. We can hear thunder far away. If you find this, tell our moms we stayed together. We're scared, but we're not mad. We stayed together. And then, pressed by a dead pen into the last blank page, in the dark, just before the storm arrived, we see flashes through the trees. The forensic revelation, November 2015, February 2016. The map was found with the notebook. It had been folded into the tin along with the journal folded so many times, and then subjected to so many years of moisture and pressure, that it had partially fused to itself and had to be separated with surgical tools under a stereo microscope by conservator Maya Chin at the University of Kentucky Conservation Lab. The process took 11 days. When it was fully recovered, digitally photographed in segments, assembled computationally into a complete image, and then rectified to modern geographic coordinates, investigators did something straightforward and devastating. They overlaid it on current satellite data. State Police investigator Carol Brannon, who led the 2015 forensic review of the case, described this moment in her testimony at the subsequent civil inquiry. We put the 1987 map on one screen and the current aerial data on another, and we started matching up the topographic features, the ridge lines, the creek channels, the elevation contours, and at first it all matched. Everything in the northern portion of the map matched. The fire tower was right where the map said it was, the main trail, the creek, all of it. And then you get to the southern portion, and the main trails are still right. The ridge lines are still right. But then there's this trail, the southern spur, and you look at where the map says it is, and you look at the satellite image, and there's nothing there. Not overgrown, not altered, just nothing. The terrain where the trail is supposed to be is a drainage slope. It drains directly into the Hollerbend Basin. It drains toward a geological trap. The Southern Spur Trail had been a real path once. According to Boyd County Parks records that Carol Brannon's team spent 2 weeks reconstructing from archived department files, the trail had been established in 1971 as a connector route between the Fire Tower Trail system and a county road to the south. It had been maintained irregularly, never receiving the attention given to the primary Fire Tower Trail. Following a significant rain event in 1978, not a dramatic storm, just a sustained wet spring that raised the water table and saturated the karst terrain, a section of the trail approximately 400 meters long had experienced subsidence. The earth had simply settled and slumped, erasing the path. A maintenance note in the park's files from September 1978 documented the damage. A follow-up note from December 1978 recommended the trail be formally decommissioned. There is no record that this decommissioning was ever communicated to the printing office that produced the recreational trail maps. There is no record that the maps were recalled or updated. The map that went onto the rack in the Parks and Recreation office in 1983, printed from plates that had not been updated since 1976, showed the southern spur as an active, passable trail. Tommy Hensley found that map on that rack. He paid 50 cents for it. He trusted it the way you trust something that has a county seal in the corner, the Hollerbend Basin. The geological feature known locally as the Hollerbend Basin. The name derived from an old family name, Hollerbend, anglicized over generations to Hollerbend, referencing the family that had farmed the adjacent land in the 19th century, is not dramatic. Viewed from its rim, it looks from the higher terrain surrounding it like a gentle depression in the forest. The tree canopy fills it and smooths its appearance, so that standing on the ridge above it you might see only a slightly lower section of forest, and nothing more alarming than that. This is precisely what makes it dangerous. The basin is, in geological terms, a compound karst depression formed by the gradual collapse and dissolution of the limestone substrate beneath it. The floor of the basin sits approximately 35 to 40 feet below the surrounding ridgelines. Its walls are not cliff faces. They are slopes, covered in vegetation, deceptively navigable going down. Getting down into the Hollerbend Basin is easy. You simply walk, following the gradient, and the forest floor carries you downward, and by the time you realize you are in a depression rather than on a slope, you are already at the bottom. Getting out is different. The basin drains through subsurface channels rather than surface streams. Water that enters it disappears underground through the porous karst beneath. This means that after rainfall, the floor of the basin fills. It does not drain the way a normal low point drains. It accumulates, and the soil at the bottom of the basin, decades of accumulated organic matter and clay, underlaid by fractured and unstable limestone, has the structural integrity of something that looks solid until it isn't. The limestone outcroppings around the basins rim the pale stone that Daniel Merritt had been following in October of 2015 when he found the tenor characteristic of the geology, fresh exposure of rock where the overlying soil has moved, has slipped. This is a place that periodically moves, a place where the ground is, on a geological timescale, in constant negotiation with itself. Carol Brannan's forensic review located the limestone overhang where the boys had sheltered, identified by the intersection of the trail error analysis and the drainage patterns and the location of. Daniel Merritt's find is a point approximately 1.1 miles south of the drainage gully where Curtis Boone's bloodhound Colonel had barked in 1987. The distance between where Colonel smelled them and where the landslide ultimately buried them was 1.1 miles. The boys had been moving south, deeper into the basin, while the search focused primarily on the eastern quadrant of the woods. They had been alive for at least 2 days. The journal entry was dated July 25th, 2 days after they entered the woods. They had found shelter. They were cold and scared and running out of food, and Mark was injured. But they were together, and they were thinking clearly enough to write down what was happening. Clearly enough to put the notebook in a tin can and put the tin can in a crack in the limestone where someone might someday find it. They did everything right. They sheltered in place when Mark was hurt, which is correct wilderness protocol. They conserved their food. They wrote down their location and their status, or as much of their location as they could determine. They stayed together, as the note says, repeatedly, as if the staying together was the thing that mattered most, the thing that someone needed to know. The storm arrived the evening of July 25th. The forensic geology report, completed by Dr. Tree, James Okafor of the University of Louisville's Earth Sciences Department, concluded that the landslide that buried the limestone overhang and its occupants was triggered within hours of the beginning of the major storm event. The slope above the overhang had been saturated by 2 days of moderate rain before the storm intensified. When the major storm event began, delivering rainfall at a rate of approximately 1.5 inches per hour, the slope failed. It would have happened quickly. The geological term is rapid debris flow, soil and fractured limestone moving downslope as a single coherent mass. Dr. Halstead's Okafor's report estimated the flow velocity at between 8 and 25 feet per second, depending on the specific conditions. He estimated the total mass of material involved at somewhere between 300 and 500 cubic meters. The invisible text, "We see flashes through the trees," was written. Carol Brannan's analysis determined, at some point in the early evening of July 25th, as the storm was approaching but before the main event arrived, they were sheltered under the limestone overhang. They could see the lightning reflected through the canopy above the basin, flashes in the sky, getting closer. They were cold, but they were together. Then the ridge came down. The sheriff's verdict. The findings were presented publicly at a press conference on February 12, 2016. Held in the same parking lot of the Boyd County Courthouse where Dale Marbury had suspended the search 28 years before. The current sheriff, Robert Elkins, was not a man given to dramatic public pronouncements. He read the findings from a prepared statement in a flat, steady voice, and answered questions methodically, and handled the cameras with the practiced composure of a law enforcement official accustomed to difficult press events. But when a reporter from the Lexington Herald-Leader asked him, near the end of the press conference, who he thought was responsible, who was accountable for what had happened to those 4 boys, something shifted in his face. He put down the statement. He looked at the assembled cameras and reporters and grieving families standing to one side, and he said, "They didn't get lost, we lost them." He let that sit for a moment. Those boys did everything right. They had a compass. They had a map issued by the county. They followed that map. The map was wrong, and nobody told them it was wrong. The county didn't update it. The county didn't pull it. It sat on a rack for years after the trail it showed had washed away, and 4 boys trusted it because why wouldn't they? You trust a map. You especially trust a map with a county seal on it. He paused again. The search went east because we thought they went east. One of our dogs knew different. The storm covered what the dog found, and we called off the search before we understood what we were actually looking at. These weren't kids who wandered off. These weren't kids who made bad decisions. These were 4 boys who did everything they were supposed to do and were failed by a system that didn't maintain its own records, didn't update its own maps, and didn't search its own geography thoroughly enough. That's on us. That's on the county. That's on everyone who put that map on that rack and left it there. Afterward, the official recovery of the boys' remains conducted over 3 weeks in February and March of 2016, with considerable delicacy given the geological instability of the area, was attended by Harold Vickers, now 57 and white-haired and working part-time at a hardware store in Kotletsburg. He stood at the rim of the Hollerbend Basin on the first morning of the recovery operation and looked down into it. It was cold. The trees were bare. The basin was exactly as he had found it in October of 2002, the depression visible now without leaves to fill it, the pale limestone outcroppings catching the flat winter light. "I was in the right place," he said, to no one in particular. "I was in the right place all along." Curtis Boone, who had driven from Moorhead at Harold Vickers' personal invitation, stood beside him. Curtis was 72 now, retired, and he had brought a photograph of Colonel with him. Colonel had died in 1998. 14 years old and still working the occasional training exercise. He held the photograph in both hands. Neither man said anything for a long time. The funeral services were held on March 28, 2016 at Boyd County Memorial Church. All 4 families were present. The town came out. Not just those who had been there in 1987 and remembered the search, but younger people who had grown up with the story, who had heard about the Colton Woods curse, who had perhaps told a version of it themselves without knowing what it really was. Linda Hensley sat in the front pew with Ray, who was 71 now, and had driven from Lexington the night before. She was holding one of the toy soldiers' green plastic, the kind you get in bags of 100 from the dollar store. She had been placing them on the stump for so long that she was not sure what she would do in July, now that she had somewhere specific to go instead. She thought she might still go to the stump. She thought she might bring Tommy's tiger's cap and leave it there, in exchange for bringing Tommy home. Beverly Porter had read the last words of Jake's notebook. She had read them so many times in the 4 months since they were recovered that she had ceased to process them as language and experienced them instead as something physical, something that lived in her chest like a stone and like a hand holding hers simultaneously. "Tell our moms we stayed together." She had been told. She was holding it. Ricky Cole's mother, Donna, sat next to Beverly and held her hand and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the 4 boys hadn't already said better in a composition notebook, in the dark, in the rain, under a limestone overhang in a geological trap that the county had accidentally built for them, with an outdated map and a decommissioned trail. "We're scared, but we're not mad. We stayed together." The Colton Fire Tower Trail and the area to its south, including the newly marked path around the rim of the Hollerbend Basin, were officially reopened to the public on July 23, 2016, the 29th anniversary of the day the boys went in. The path around the basin's rim was designated by the Boyd County Parks Department as the 4 Pines Path, named for the 4 white pines that grew at the southern edge of the basin rim, survivors of whatever the terrain had thrown at them, their roots deep in the fractured limestone. A small metal marker was placed at the rim. It read, "In memory of Tommy, Jake, Mark, and Ricky." They stayed together. The map on the Parks and Recreation rack, the new one, printed in 2016, with GPS-verified coordinates and current trail data, and a notation in the bottom margin that said verified and updated February 2016, showed the Four Pines path clearly. It showed the Hollerbend Basin labeled with a note about the terrain. It showed every trail that actually existed. It did not show the southern spur. Because the southern spur was never there, it had washed away in 1978, and the rain had swallowed it, and four boys had followed a ghost of a path into a bowl of limestone and karst, and had done everything right, and had held each other in the dark and the thunder while the slope above them reached its limit, and the last thing they had in common with the map they trusted was the certainty that they were not alone. They stayed together. And the forest kept that for 28 years, and then it gave them back.